As we're writing code, we want to make sure that we're always going to be able to make sense of it again at a later point. By this I mean, in a few years of not looking at your code, you should be able to look back at it again and understand exactly what each part of your code does within about a minute or so. The best way to do this is to break our code down into smaller, more manageable and readable chunks, and we're going to use classes and methods to do that. We have actually been using methods and classes already in our code. System.out.println is actually a method called println, and that method is within a subclass called out, and that subclass is within a class called system. If you think of files and folders on your computer, a method would be like a file, and a class would be like a folder. So you will know that you can have many files within a folder, and you can also have many folders within other folders. In Java we also have a concept called packages, which could be compared to specific drives on your computer. Packages, however, are actually folders in which classes are saved on your computer. And you can see that the package we have used so far is called main, which means that there is a folder on our computer called main, which has a file in it called launch, which is where all of our code is saved. We have actually also been using a method throughout the series called main. Main is actually a special method, because if you have a main method within a class, it will always be run first, but we can copy that format of the main method to add more methods. So let's talk about our main method for a moment. First off, you can see that we have the word public. This is what we use to specify what is called the scope of the method, and this just means that it can be accessed from any other piece of code that knows about it in the project. So we could do launch.method1 later to access a method called method1 inside of a launch class. The other main alternative to public is private, and that means that if we had a method called method2 which was private, we couldn't access it in the same way that we did with method1. Typing launch.method2 would give you an error. We will talk about this more later on in a section called More on Methods. Next up we have the word static. We will talk more about this later too, but we will always include the word static until much later in this series. Next we have the word void. This is what's known as the return type. When it comes to passing data back and forth between methods later on, we will need to know what type of data is being passed, just like when we were creating variables earlier. So earlier we had things like int, double, string, etc. And we use those same data types here to pass data from a method back to the method that called it. If we don't want to pass any data back, we use the word void, which is Java's way of saying nothing. If you are going to pass data back, the final line of the code in the method should be the word return, followed by the variable that you want to pass back. Java won't process anything in the method after the line containing the word return has been executed, so you will normally see the return line as the last line or one of the last few lines if the specific value you're going to pass back is conditional. It's also important to know that you can only pass back one variable per method, so you do need to be very specific when you're designing your methods about what they are actually going to do. Fortunately, there's no limit to the number of methods you can have, and by using the scope properly that we mentioned earlier, you can keep the inner workings of your code separate to what the rest of your project can see. Next up we have the name of the method. The same rules apply to the name as we discussed it when we were talking about variables earlier. So the name must be made up of alphabetical characters, upper or lowercase, etc. Because the name follows the exact same rules as we have already discussed when we were talking about variables, there's not much else to say other than the fact that it is conventional for method names to start with a lowercase letter. Starting it with an uppercase letter won't stop the code from running, but it will look out of place when it's in amongst a bunch of other methods within your code. Finally, within brackets we have parameters. This is just a list of variables that must be passed across when it comes to calling the method. So for example, when we call the println method on line 12 here, we also pass across the value of the variable called total. The println method has some built-in functionality so that you can pass across numbers like we have here, and it will convert that number into a string. But normally you would have to be careful about the type of data that you're passing across to make sure that it's in the right format. If you're passing across more than one variable, the variables need to be separated by a comma. When it comes to accessing your method, you just need to type the method's name and pass any parameters across. So in this example, we have created a method to add two numbers together called addNumbers. In our main method, we are going to pass values 1 and 3 over to our method, which is then going to add them together and pass the result back across to our main method. We've also assigned the result into the variable we have created called output. Finally, we have printed the output to the screen. There's obviously not much going on here in terms of code, but imagine having to do something really complex, like running a bank with millions of customers. Instead of having to know how an entire bank works all of the time that you want to change any part of the code, and dealing with all of the complexity, you're able to spread that complexity out over many small methods, with each individual method being very simple. All of a sudden, one big, huge, complicated problem becomes many small, much simpler problems. So we've talked about the need to break our code down into smaller methods, but how big should each method be? As a general rule, if your method is more than about 10 to 15 lines of actual code in length, without any blank lines, you're probably not being as specific as you need to be. But there's no one right answer to this question, and it depends entirely on what the specific piece of code you're writing actually does. You also need to acknowledge the fact that if you're new to programming, you probably aren't going to be doing things the most effective way possible, which may mean that your methods are slightly longer. You should also remember that the entire point of using methods is to break your code into much more manageable and readable chunks. So that should be your ultimate goal, rather than trying to reach a specific level of granularity.